Hello everyone, welcome to Pikeville History Moments, where we talk about the history and heritage of Pikeville, Kentucky, and the surrounding area. The day we are releasing this video marks the 80th anniversary of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. We have recently learned that among those sailors and Marines present for the attack were 4 young men from our area. So today, we hope to honor their service by telling you what we know of their stories. Japan had formed an empire in East Asia and had been at war with China since 1937. In Europe, Germany invaded Poland in 1939 in the opening attacks of World War II, and in late 1940, they formed the Axis alliance with Italy and Japan. In less than a year, Germany had subdued most of continental Europe, had operated a massive bombing campaign against Great Britain, and then, in June, it began an invasion of the Soviet Union. In the United States, the memory of World War I was still fresh in the minds of citizens and politicians alike, and there was a general reluctance to getting involved in new foreign wars. Still, the US had responded to Japanese attacks on China and other Asian territories by putting in place economic sanctions, and tensions between the two countries continued to mount. Late in 1941, Japanese leadership decided the solution to their shortage of oil and other resources was to take control of the Dutch East Indies. But they worried about American intervention. To prevent this, they planned a sneak attack on Pearl Harbor, the forward base of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, in an attempt to cripple the ability of the United States to project power in Eastern Asia. They hoped this would demoralize public opinion and that any war with the United States would be over in less than 6 months. Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku ordered the Japanese Imperial Navy Armada, including 6 aircraft carriers, 65 total ships, and nearly 400 planes, to set out on a journey of around 3,500 miles to a launch point 230 miles north of Oahu. They maintained strict radio silence and avoided trade routes on their trip to preserve the secrecy of the attack. The path our 4 young men from Pike County took to get there was of course quite different. 3 of them, Millard Burk Jr., Harding Coolidge Blackburn, and Glen Homer Robinson, were friends who had decided to enlist together in June of 1940. They were assigned to the USS Oklahoma later that year. The 4th Pike Countyan at Pearl Harbor that day was Jack C. Buckley. He was from somewhere north of Pikeville, and according to census records, his family owned a general store. Some of Jack Buckley's family recently donated some items related to his service to the Big Sandy Heritage Center Museum. Those items give us some insight into how he came to be at Pearl Harbor. After completing his training at Naval Station Great Lakes in Chicago, Illinois, he mailed a postcard to his mother, Lydia, dated December 6th of 1940. In the postcard, Jack explains that he had been assigned to the USS Arizona and would immediately depart for the 5-day train trip to Bremerton, Washington, where he would board his new ship. The Oklahoma was a 27,500-ton Nevada-class battleship, while the Arizona was the flagship of the Pacific Fleet and was a 31,400-ton Pennsylvania-class battleship. Both ships had been in the Pacific, but President Roosevelt had reassigned them to Pearl Harbor in December of 1940, and both were moored to Ford Island on Battleship Row on the morning of the attack. Battleship Row was a grouping of 8 U.S. battleships with several of them side by side. The Oklahoma was near the front and on the outside, so it was exposed to more torpedo fire, while the Arizona was 2 rows back and on the inside. And that is where our local boys were the morning of the attack. 3 below decks on the USS Oklahoma, and the other aboard the Arizona. We don't know about Buckley, but the 3 Oklahoma sailors had been up late the night before playing pinochle. Robinson would later say that being an early riser saved his life. The 3 of them planned to go to Ford Island to play baseball to pass away an easy Sunday. Robinson woke up early, finished his breakfast, and went back to see if Burk and Blackburn were ready to go. The 2 men decided that they would wait until the 9 o'clock boat departed for the island so they could have breakfast, but they convinced Robinson to go ahead to save them a spot. The first wave of the attack consisted of over 180 Japanese planes made up of fighters, bombers, and torpedo bombers. When they reached the north edge of Oahu, they spread out to approach Pearl Harbor, which was on the southern end, from all 4 points of the compass. Homer Robinson arrived on the deck a few minutes before 8 o'clock and noticed an airplane approaching in a dive. He didn't realize what was happening until he saw a torpedo drop out of the plane and then noticed the red circle on its side. Moments later, the torpedo exploded below the waterline. Robinson's first instinct was to descend back down into the body of the ship to warn his friends, and that's exactly what he did. But after 2 more explosions rocked the ship, it dawned on him that the first one had detonated near their quarters. He realized that Burk and Blackburn had likely died in that first explosion, having never known they were under attack. Homer turned around and went back up topside to see if he could help on deck. But given its location, the Oklahoma was an easy target, and as many as 9 torpedoes successfully struck the battleship. The hits came so fast that the anti-aircraft guns never managed to get underway. Not long after he began running along the deck, the 4th explosion knocked Robinson into the water, which is already covered with oil and flames. He dove and swam below the flames until he saw a clear spot to rise. He spotted a whaleboat and its crew quickly brought him aboard. From there, they watched the Oklahoma roll over on its side, where it would eventually come to rest, never to return to service. Meanwhile, on the Arizona, reports of survivors say the air raid alarm went off at 7:55, and the general quarters call rang out shortly thereafter. The anti-aircraft guns began firing almost immediately. The Arizona was shielded from torpedoes by the USS Vestal, a repair ship that was moored to the outside. So the Japanese targeted the Arizona with armor-piercing bombs dropped from about 3,000 meters. The Japanese scored 4 hits and 3 near misses. Survivors report fires and injuries throughout the ship. Most of the survivors suffered some wounds of their own, with burns, cuts, shrapnel, and even damage from the bullets fired from Japanese aircraft. This is the environment that Jack Buckley was fighting in when he lost his life. At 8:06, the 4th bomb to hit the Arizona seems to have ignited the ship's forward powder magazines, resulting in a tremendous explosion. The damage was catastrophic, cracking the hull, destroying the inner structure of the front half of the ship, and igniting a fire that would burn for 2 days. It seems likely that it was this explosion that caused the whaleboat that Homer Robinson was riding on to capsize, and he found himself swimming yet again. He was able to grab onto a 16-inch fuel line that extended onto Ford Island and walked it like a tightrope. There, he immediately began helping transport the wounded to get them medical attention. The second wave of the attack consisted of 167 aircraft, but they were less successful. By this time, American anti-aircraft guns were filling the sky with rounds, and 29 of those aircraft were destroyed. The Japanese broke off their attack at around 10 o'clock, and the fleet returned home, thinking they had achieved a great victory. In some ways, they were correct. They had temporarily crippled the offensive capabilities of the United States in the Pacific, and within days, they had followed that up with other attacks throughout the South Pacific and had established naval superiority in that region. However, there were tactical errors on that day. First, the 3 American aircraft carriers were out at sea and were unscathed. Second, all ships damaged that day were eventually put back into service except for the Oklahoma and the Arizona. And finally, the harbor infrastructure was left almost completely intact, with repair facilities and fuel tanks going untouched. More importantly, though, the sneak attack had resulted in a monumental strategic error. It had galvanized the people of the United States in a way that is hard to imagine happening otherwise. In one of the most famous speeches in United States history, President Franklin Roosevelt asked for and received a declaration of war from Congress on the next day.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
Germany quickly declared war on the United States, and we followed suit. Many historians think the United States would have eventually joined World War II even without the attack on Pearl Harbor, but further delay could have proved disastrous to our allies. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor killed 2,335 service members and 68 civilians, for a total of 2,403 people dead, along with 1,178 wounded. Of those, 1,177 were aboard the USS Arizona. But those deaths were in service to a great cause. Less than 4 years later, the Allies had proven victorious in both Europe and Asia. And what of our 4 sailors? Homer Robinson was the only one of them to survive Pearl Harbor, and he continued to serve in the Pacific throughout the war, seeing action in places like Guadalcanal and Midway. He received 2 Presidential Unit citations, 5 Bronze Stars, several Silver Stars, and a Good Conduct Medal. After the war, he owned and operated a service station for many years before serving as a bailiff for the Pike County Circuit Court. He passed in 1998. Harding Coolidge Blackburn and Millard Burk Jr. were both among the 429 crew members of the USS Oklahoma who perished at Pearl Harbor. Only 35 sets of remains were initially identified, with the rest being declared dead by missing. Blackburn and Burke's remains were not among those identified, and their names are therefore recorded on the cords of the missing at the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific, which is also known as the Punch Bowl. However, in 2018, Burk's remains were identified using forensic techniques. He was reburied in July of 2019, and a rosette was placed next to his name to indicate that he was accounted for. Due to the difficulty of the salvage operation, the Navy made the decision to leave the USS Arizona at the bottom of Pearl Harbor, where it came to rest 80 years ago. Those souls lost that day are considered to be buried at sea. Upon request, the 355 men assigned to the USS Arizona who survived the attack are also eligible for burial at the site. Jack Buckley's remains lie there with his brothers in arms. In 1962, a war memorial was built over the sunken ship. Over 2 million people visit the memorial each year to honor the men who gave their lives there. Blackburn, Burk, and Buckley were each awarded Purple Hearts for their sacrifice. We're thankful for their service and honor the sacrifice of those who were at Pearl Harbor 80 years ago, as well as the service of all veterans, especially those from Pikeville and Pike County. Thank you for watching Pikeville History Moments. If you're watching this on YouTube, please hit like and subscribe, or click on the link to our website at visitpikeville.com. If you're in Pikeville, be sure to visit the Big Sandy Heritage Center Museum to view the artifacts donated by the family of Jack Buckley.